is a long time in the making. We started a group 26 years ago. So, and then I think this grant was submitted in 2018 when we always were told we need a paper assessment before we get money to fix it. So this is our first step where we have the assessment, we have the reclamation plan, and now we can take this and try to get things fixed. So just like to thank DEP for funding through Growing Greener, like Aaron for his hard work, and Brady Fire Company for letting us have this here. So Aaron, you can take it over.
Thank you. Thanks for coming out. It's awesome to see this much support. This is actually a really good crowd for a presentation such as this. It's good to see so many people caring about the watershed. So essentially, a number of years ago, the watershed group contacted me and said, let's put together a grant application because we have a lot of things that are wrong, but we don't know what to do about them in an orderly fashion. And we know we need to fix this and we know we need to fix that, but it's really hard to figure out the sequence of how this should all happen and what the real priorities are. And we started talking about the whole restoration process. How do you take a watershed that has had thousands of people working for 100 years to basically get stuff out of the ground and not really care what they left behind, and now we're all stuck with this water quality issue where our stream isn't as clean as it could be, and the land isn't necessarily as productive as it could be from an environmental standpoint and from an economic standpoint. How do you get that water quality so that people want to stay here, people want to walk along the creek, people want to just be out experiencing nature? They want to fish, they want to kayak in the river as it gets farther down, things like that. How do you change the culture of the creek to this better water quality? So you have that vision, you have the people who are the initial leaders, and they say, you know what, we can do something about water quality. And then the hard part starts to happen, which is finding that funding for the initial study and putting that together. We got the grant from Growing Greener, and then we use that to now complete this third check, which is getting the restoration plan done. And now as we get through that, this plan isn't really useful at all unless we actually do something with it. And the watershed group has already started to make those strides of securing funding for priority restoration projects. There's a project right now at Veterans Memorial Park, right below Coltmont, that the watershed group is actively pursuing. They have some funding in hand, they have designs, they have permits that are being reviewed right now to actually help do some of these watershed improvements. And then over time, you want to just sort of evaluate how effective those were, and eventually you'll convey the lessons learned. I've done these kind of projects over the last 15 or so years, and generally it takes about a decade to get to the point where you're going back and saying, did we really make a difference? Because these funding cycles take a year or two, everything takes a long time. It's a long view, but remember, thousands of people for 100 years versus we're working towards this since around 1970s when environmental action started to really start occurring. And I think it's 26 years or so that the watershed group is in place. So things take time, that's for sure. So with the watershed study, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we did and how we assessed the stream. I'm going to not get real deep into data. I'm going to talk more about what we can do moving forward. But one of the things we did was we went back and reviewed old aerial photos. And with that, there's a number of them printed out over there. There's aerials from the 1930s, and we could take those and bring them into GIS and piece them together so that they matched up, that you could look and compare different years, what happened and what changed in the watershed. And that starts to tell you about what's going on there. A very important part of that, which really doesn't present well in a forum such as this, the folks at Eastern Pennsylvania Coalition for Abandoned Mine Reclamation were a partner, and they sent us a bunch of underground mine mapping. And there's a lot of interesting stuff for geologists there. Essentially, what you need to know is the whole valley was full of coal. There's still a lot of coal there. but they basically mined everywhere. Like underneath us, there were so many mines. It's really complicated. It's really complex. And those areas where they were mining, they came down and they left sections of coal, and those are called barrier pillars. So that helps to determine where the water is popping back up to the surface. Understanding that whole complicated underground stuff all comes into play, but essentially for this study, you need to know that if you pour water and it quickly goes into the ground in this watershed, in Quaker Run or Buck Run, it's probably going down into the mines and it's probably coming else up somewhere else polluted. So we looked at that. We looked at it for, I'll go back here a second, for Quaker Run watershed. So basically, right here is Coltmont, Marion Heights, and then coming down, and we're about in here as it comes down into the Shamokin Creek. And we looked at the entirety of the watershed. Underground, the hydrology is more complicated for these watersheds in that some of the mines in other areas are actually also contributing water here. So it's more of a regional scale concern. We also looked at Buck Run, and Shamokin is right down here, and essentially this area has the big mountain discharge here, and essentially this whole area was mined in the past and is contributing some of the mine drainage, and we'll talk more about them as we go along. Overall, the watersheds are pretty forested. So we did a study where we looked at what the cover is there impervious, or are there a lot of blacktop, which is an issue in many other areas. And really, in Quaker Run, about 9% of the surface area is blacktop, which isn't enough to really be a major problem for the stream. It's not good, but you definitely can deal with that from a biology standpoint to try to restore a stream. And Buck Run actually is very little impervious area and is mostly forested. So as part of the study, what we did is to get background data, we broke it into various sub-watersheds and we studied what was going on the surface. But then we came in and we collected water samples. So essentially, we have a bunch of little points, I think there's 10 of them, where we routinely sampled on a quarterly basis, or I think 4 times. And then we also had ice sampling. And the ice sampling is where we did a more comprehensive study, where we looked at the habitat of the stream. We looked at the riparian buffer, so things growing along the stream, if there's trees there. And we also looked at the macroinvertebrates, so the insects and the other little critters that are living within the channel itself. As we talk about the area, essentially, I'm going to talk about Quaker Run, which is coming down through this way. I'm going to talk a little bit about Dark Run, which is the major tributary to Quaker Run. This is primarily fed by mine discharges here, and down where we are. Where are we at? Right there? Or is it farther down? Right in here, I guess. The mine discharge would be there. And then also in Buck Run, and you can see the relationship here to where Shamokin is located. So with that, we did a whole bunch of water quality work, and we analyzed what was going on with the stream. And you're welcome to download the assessment report if you're into that and you want to really get a sense for what the water quality is. There's a bunch of tables there. I'm going to try to summarize it quickly for tonight and say that in Buck Run, the pH is really low, to the point where that's really a major problem. So if you look at the pH of our samples, it's hard to know where they were at, but this right here is down in the Buck Run area. And with this number here, above a 5.5 is essentially where trout can start to live. So gives you a sense that they're definitely there's pH issues, but it's not the major issue. The major issue is metals in a lot of these areas coming out of the stream, and just an overwhelming amount of metals. Some of the discharges are at the point where to bring those metals down, it's like 1,000 pounds per day of iron being discharged into the stream. It's a lot. It's hard to conceptualize that constant flow. But there's things we can do about it. We also looked at the water, like more in depth. We compared dissolved oxygen. We found that dissolved oxygen really wasn't the problem. It really comes down to a lot of those metal discharges and the other contaminants picked up in the water. I'll talk a little bit about that maybe. Essentially, as the water infiltrates into the mines, it interacts with the rocks there, and it has a chemical reaction where it creates some acid that helps to leach out these metals that are normally underground. It then picks them up and brings them to the surface. And when the oxygen in the surface, where it comes discharges, reacts, it releases it into the water, and you can think of rust happening. So that orange color you see in the creek is essentially where the oxygen is mixing in and now starting to release that that bit of metal that was picked up underground. And a lot of those metals can be toxic to various forms of life, as far as like insects and things. So what we did as part of this study is we went out and we collected insects from each of these various sites. And we found 12 different kinds of insects, 12 different taxa within Quaker Run and Buck Run. And those were all very pollution tolerant species. So as water quality improves, those various species, there's more types of bugs and there's more bugs, and essentially they really start to increase. So we found that the sort of the roughest spot to be if you were an insect would be right where the bottom of Dark Run is, and you have all of those mine discharges coming into there. But it was really interesting because as you look at Dark Run, it's so contaminated that the insects could hardly live there in that mine discharge. But right on the little branch of Quaker Run coming up, there's actually sections that have fish in it. So if we can restore the water quality, the critters will return. They'll work their way back up from other sections of the watershed. We're talking today about how in Shamokin Creek, there's sections that have trout in it. There's fish in portions of Quaker Run, but they're so isolated from each other by sections that have no flow because of infiltration into the mines, and then also sections that have really rough water quality. So also we looked at habitat, and this is essentially a score for what's going on as far as, is there a place for fish to hide in the stream? Is there a place for an insect to hide in the stream? And what we found is that overall the habitat numbers show as impaired, but they were still pretty good in that there's a lot of forest along the creek, which is a good thing. There's a lot of potential habitat there, except this amount of metal coming into the creek is actually almost smothering the bottom. So rather than all kinds of little nooks and crannies where the insects can get in underneath the rocks, it just is sort of a flat section of muck. And if you go and walk in there, you'll very quickly learn that it's a lot deeper than it looks in a lot of the mine discharge sections. So then after we understood the water quality, and please, if you're interested, read the assessment report. It gets into a much more scientific version of all of that. We started to think about how do you restore the creek? How do you come in and take sections where the banks are eroded and pull them back and then restore them so that they eventually look like this and start to really function as an area that's not giving sediment or is taking up some of these things that are being discharged. And to do that, to figure out what do we do where to try to improve things, we had to put together a plan. And we did that by completing a stream walk where we went out and we GPS located any kind of priority site and as an action item. And then we had to put together cost estimates and come up with ideas to reach out to the right landowners, because it's nice to know you want to do something, but you at least need an order of magnitude idea of cost. So the goal was to sort of create this shopping list where the watershed group can say, here's a grant funding source, or here's some other funding source that we can pull from. What project can we do with that money? What's a good match for our list of projects? And in the plan, we have one project that's $70 million, but we have another project that's $50. So there's a whole gamut of things that you can pick from, whether they're a small litter cleanup or a small tree planting. All of it helps to make a difference and bring people on board. When I was in middle school, there was a section of the Schuylkill that I grew up in Schuylkill Haven, right near Landingville. There was a marsh there that I would go out to with my dad, and we would walk along the railroad tracks there to hunt. And you look and it was completely full of litter, just completely full of trash. And there's a section of Old Canal there just completely full of trash. There was a community cleanup that in one day pulled out about 3 rollbacks full of material from there and hauled it away, and a whole other pile of tires that got hauled away. In one day, the community cleaned that whole marsh out and changed it. And now there's a walking trail there that's people go and walk and stroll along, and have no idea how it used to look. But I can remember pulling a refrigerator out of there, and that made a difference in my mind and helped me to become an environmental scientist, to see that happen. So even those small projects can really matter if they start changing people's perspective on the fact that things can be done. That's an aside. So anyhow, we took the GPS unit and the camera, and we walked along the creek, and we started just taking notes and seeing things, and trying to figure out what's going on. And from that, we created this map that there's one laying over there, and this is just a small section of it to give you an idea. And I'm hoping to sort of whet your appetite to go in and look at the plan we put together. And essentially, each of these numbers is a spot where, as the Conservation District watershed specialist at the time, and Jim and I and Steve and some of the other folks that came out along the stream, thought that something was of note. And some of those things were just rather simple points that didn't amount to much, maybe just a discharge or pipe or something like that. But then there's other sections that were an area where something really needed to be done. Like here, there's a strip mine pit, and the stream was diverted around it, and it's leaking down into there. And we prioritize projects. So there's different colors. So there's yellow, which is low priority, medium priority, and as you might imagine, the red are the high priority stream projects. And this all matches up with what we found in the scientific assessment to say, here are the real problems in the watershed. It matches up with what the state regulators are saying needs to be done to help fix up the water here, because they're concerned about what is coming downstream. Because if we don't do anything here to help improve downstream, that section's never going to get better. And if we make those differences here that actually help people downstream, we have a much more competitive brand. So we're trying to match all of those priorities with the science in this plan. So for each of these individual GPS points, we put together a description and an action item and who the watershed group might want to talk to about that, and then also the priority. So, and like here, some of them are just, here's the end of the large wetlands, but then other one, it's like, here you would like to stabilize this portion of the road. As we move forward with the presentation tonight, I'm only going to talk about the high priority projects, but you might imagine that there's a whole list of medium and low priority, most of which are less expensive and less of a struggle to complete than the other ones. So then we step back and we looked at the watershed as a whole, and you can see all these little points and whatnot. Those all match up to the GPS points. They all match up to the high priority projects. And then we came up with, well, what are those projects? So I'm going to talk a little bit about each one of those as we move forward. So essentially, this project is at the Veterans Memorial Veterans Memorial Park, where the ball fields are at, right below Coltmont. You might be familiar with this bridge here. Essentially, just upstream from here, the water often is flowing, but it infiltrates into the mine pool. So the idea is, normally this should be a stream on the surface where it's located, but it infiltrates and it goes down into the mines, and every gallon of water that goes down is going to eventually pop up as contaminated water. So if we do things in the headwaters to keep that water on the surface, thoughtfully understanding that there are potentials for downstream flooding impacts, and we need to account for all of that. But generally, it slowly infiltrates through these areas on a small base flow, but those large storm events are still ripping through the watershed, creating the flooding issues. And in those scenarios, it's usually so saturated that it's ripping through anyway. So we have to be thoughtful about that. But essentially, what we're working to do here is what's called streamlining, or putting a liner in the stream. So you can come in, and we're going to dig out the stream 4 feet deep and put a clay liner in there. And then come back, and we're going to put 4 feet of soil back in there with rock. Well, we can think of them as they're called a cross vein, but almost like a rock structure to help keep that in place and in shape. And the idea is that the water will still infiltrate into that area that we have exposed, but it won't make it all the way down to the mines, and it will help to keep that water at the low flow events from getting down into the actual mine pool and keep water on the surface. As we were going through the permit process, one of the people that was very newly looking at the project for the first time, he said, "Well, have you talked to the Fish Commission? Because typically we do." And my reply is, we need water first. That's the first ingredient for fish, is water. So here, we're trying to get water back, but we're doing it in a thoughtful, holistic manner where we're hoping to retain some of that water in this layer of material so that it leaches out slowly. So it sort of seeps out, and over time, we link this project with projects in Coltmont Borough where they're proposing to do water quality things, like you've seen different rain gardens and things like that, but with the clay liner to keep it from going to the mine pool, so that over time, this water can return to the surface and hopefully help to be linked with other projects that could help to restore fish and water quality. Just downstream of there's another section that is on a section of property that isn't publicly owned. That section would be a great place to do additional work. Same kind of thing where it's infiltrating down into the mine pool, and hopefully over time we can work to line some of the stream in those areas. I feel that every landowner that we talked to as we began the project and worked through it was very receptive to the ideas. But over time, I think putting that first project in and seeing it work and seeing that it's a good thing will help to hopefully get some of the other landowners on board. This is a section of Quaker Run where this is Quaker Run right here, and this is a big strip pit, essentially where they came in, took the coal out, left the hole there, but diverted the creek around it. This water quality really isn't that bad here. They have a clay liner in this section of it, but to restore that to its historic stream will be a major project to come in and reclaim the stripping pit. But when that reclamation occurs, it would be great to put the creek at the right place in the landscape, so in the center of the valley, so that this is fixed one time and more permanently. Downstream of there's a section that, if you're local, you're probably familiar with, where there's some subsidence issues that this bridge has been shut down for quite some time. The real solution to fix a lot of these areas, and I'm very clear with it in the plan, as an environmental scientist, relining areas and reclaiming them is the long-term best fix in many areas in the watershed. It's coming back in and trying to address those areas. that's not practical on many sites. And in those sites, doing things like clay lining the channels, trying to keep the water on the surface, is oftentimes the best one to think about. And then in some of these areas, we also have the channel eroding out because it's sort of flashy when it flows through there. This is very close to, is it Reinhardt? Just above that. And there's a wetland there that has fish in it. And just below that whole area, there's also fish. The problem is that section of stream just below there also infiltrates into the mines. So it only flows on nice days, but it shows you that the water quality can be achieved to get fish back if we can link projects together over time. Within the plan, we highlight some areas where we essentially have mine shafts that could use some attention as far as making sure that they're secured so that no one can get in there from like a safety issue, but also there's water quality issues from the various discharges. One of the other big issues outside of the mine, I've been talking about mine stuff because that's overarching, is that there's sections of the sewer system in the area, the watershed, where the stormwater pipes and the sewer pipes are combined and they discharge together into the creek. So there's a really good action plan that essentially takes that stormwater and separates it out. So the idea is that when you get a huge rain event, the sewer plant becomes overwhelmed with the volume of water coming to it. So when that happens, they are able to chlorinate to kill any pathogens, but essentially everything else just discharges directly into the creek. That creates nutrient issues, and it's just not conducive to recreation, as you might imagine. So I guess what I want to say is there's a really good plan to do this that's already in place. We really didn't dive into it in our watershed study, but it is a high priority project, and any project that's happening in the local municipalities to separate the storm sewer can definitely reference this as this is something that needs to happen for water quality in our area. But other than really pushing to help get funding and pushing any legislators or any of the local representatives to take this seriously and push for additional funding, this is something that has to happen at the municipal level from an implementation standpoint. The problem is many of them want to do all of this, but just need more funding to do it. And with that, we'll talk a little bit more about mine drainage. So within Quaker Run, there is the Scott Mine Tunnel, and it has some pH issues, but it also has a lot of contamination from metals. And there's a couple different ways that this can be treated. One of the more likely ways that it will be accomplished is to put in an active treatment plant where they will go out and actively treat on an ongoing basis by mixing chemicals in to deposit it out. For some of the sites, it is possible to do like a passive treatment where there's like a large wetland system that would allow things to precipitate out and basically collect them in those wetlands. Colbert is one that might be able to be treated with a more passive system, but because it's less volume of water than some of the other ones, and there's a little bit more space there. But ultimately, with our project, we came up with ideas for how it could be done, but an in-depth engineering study of each of those discharges as they come to be funded will be needed. Within Buck Run watershed, the main problem is the Big Mountain discharge right here, which is really lowering the pH throughout the watershed. The stream itself is actually pretty nice. There's nice cobble in there. You walk up to it and it looks good from a habitat standpoint. But there's a lot of metal in there, and the pH is about 4.4. So on a pH scale, it is a logarithmic scale. So 1 digit of pH is 10 times as much. So something that is a pH of 7 is considered neutral, a pH 6 is 10 times, a pH of 5 is 100 times. So a 4.4, when I said that a 5.5 is where trout might be able to start making it, this is 100 times, or sorry, 10 times more acidic than that. So this here site, one of the struggles is that there's not a lot of land to do the actual project. So this would be a good candidate for an active treatment system because it takes up less space. Also, working to do restoration upstream would really be helpful as far as reclamation work. Overall, the reclamation could be somewhere on the order for the whole watershed of like 70 to 140 million dollars. It's a sizable chunk of money. But we spend money in a lot of dumber places as a society. So, you know, there's that. But the reality is you can do smaller projects that can make a huge difference, like the one happening at Veterans Memorial as a start. One of the other places that can be addressed as part of the plan is the various culm piles and trying to keep those from leaching out into the watershed, restoring those, and trying to sort of put those sections at the top of the watershed back where things will run off and get into the creek without infiltrating. So that's one of the real takeaways that I'm hoping you'll have from tonight, is that if you're in the headwaters of these various streams and you know there's mines underneath it, it's good to keep the water on the surface for those lower discharges. You still need to think about the flooding waters and that, but trying to keep it from infiltrating because it's going to pop out contaminated later, and then also treating those contaminated areas. Also within the watershed plan, we came up with restoration BMPs, so essentially best management practices. And there's a variety of handouts that the watershed group or other interested folks like the Conservation District could use as a guide to help talk to landowners, talk to various folks that might be interested in implementing things on their property, whether it's things to stabilize the stream channels, stabilize the banks, create wetlands. There's a number of places where there's people cutting back and forth across the channel with whether it's ATV trails or roads. You can do things to try to divert some of that water to keep it from discharging silt right into the creek, which when you discharge silt into the creek, it helps cover up things in the bottom, but it also helps to block up any of the culvert pipes and things like that downstream. And then within the plan, we talk about each of those individual BMPs, and we have a write-up on what they are, trying to explain what they are, so that if you take the time to read it, it will help to sort of let you figure out what we're actually proposing to do for each of them. After we go out and reach those landowners, we'll need to do various restoration designs. We'll put together grading plans, and then go out and finally, after all of that, we'll be able to go out and start pulling back the banks and stabilizing the areas that need it and treating the discharges. So hopefully that was a helpful introduction. There's a whole lot in the various plan reports, and I encourage you to read them. They are available. We can get you a PDF of them so you can take them and spend as much time with them as you like. And with that, I ask for other questions or comments. I nervously ask for that.
Want a copy of the report? We can just email you.
You could email me or Jim or Steve. Is there someone from the organization that would?
I can take care of that.
Okay.
Yep, if you want to talk to me after.
The full report is on our website.
It is as well, yeah.
Oh, it is? Okay.
Shamokincreek.org. We have a resources section on there, and his report is on there. We'll also get the presentation loaded after.
So when you look there, there's two reports. There's the assessment report, and then there's the restoration plan. This one is written with the intent of trying to encourage other scientists to say this is what's going on out here and this is why it's important, but still written at a level that hopefully is reachable for most folks. And this is written basically to say, here's what we can do to fix it. And hopefully it's written that in a way that everybody can understand, that it's not some just jargon-full scientific study. My wife, she's an educator, and she helps with it. And also my daughter Cora is a young biologist who is very good at trying to put things into phrasing that is more reachable than mine sometimes. So. Yes.
Question. I live in Ewensburg. These projects here, will this mitigate the stuff coming down into the dash area as well? Or is there stuff below this that have to be addressed outside of these two ones?
Well, these would address things that are coming down towards Shamokin from Quaker Run. So they focus on just that Coltmont area, and then down into Shamokin Creek, and then from Shamokin Creek where it goes out to Susquehanna.
Right. Because Little Shamokin is very nice and fishable, and Big Shamokin, I guess, impact science is not.
Right. Where I grew up in Schuylkill Haven, it's like I grew up on the south side of the Second Mountain, and then as you cross the mountain, you come into the coal fields, and it's so different in how the streams are. Yes.
Wayside down that or whatever, there's 13 different species of fish in that stuff in that river, in that creek. It goes all the way into the river. And we've had reports of that stuff coming out of Sunbury and that stuff, where Shamokin Creek enters into the river. And there's walleye and that stuff coming up the channel.
I'm sorry. Yes, there was a question back there.
I just was wondering, Quaker runs a tributary to Shamokin.
Shamokin Creek. Yes.
What's the relative discharge from Quaker Run?
Relative discharge. I'm going to turn to the watershed specialist. I'm going to say approximately 10%, but I don't know.
I haven't taken any recent measurements on discharge from Quaker Run, but 10% sounds roughly accurate.
It is all I'm interested
Yeah.
Yeah, and the idea that the watershed group had is, they're responsible for all of Shamokin Creek, but there's so much, it's overwhelming. So a good model for fixing things up is to pick a sub watershed and then target that with a restoration plan and start working within that. And then as you gain momentum there and hopefully gain more members and gain more interest, branch out into additional sub watersheds over time. Generally, it takes about 10 years to sort of work through the projects with a dedicated effort before you're really into another watershed. And it's not Shamokin Creek Restoration Alliance alone. The municipalities are interested. Coltmont Borough is leading the charge for the construction of the project at Veterans Memorial. And also, I'm going to turn to the Conservation District because the watershed specialist at Conservation District has a tremendous ability to help make things like this happen, although he's completely overwhelmed with the amount of the county as a whole. So, but
Don't forget, he's got the northern part of the county too, up near Lewisburg, and that stuff. Streams that go up there. And he's got a big job in that stuff to do it. Being a watershed specialist in this section is a full-time job, just for one guy.
thousands of people for 100 years, one guy. So, it's,
Try my best.
yeah.
So, with the recent infrastructure bill, they're gonna devote $244 million to the state of PA this year. Over the next 3 years, that will be the same amount of money for 3 years. That money will be more money than they ever spent in the state of Pennsylvania, cleaning strips of these streams up. So this is personally my most hopeful I've ever been in 25 years that this could really make a difference. So there's big things coming. And I mean, we have all the steps in place already to make these happen. So we have all the right contacts and we're moving in the right direction.
So Steve, have you applied for grants already to begin this, or do you have some money to begin with this?
We have a certain part of money to start up in Veterans Field. We got $100,000 devoted from a DEP fine, which we have a permits in process now. The design's done. So that one, it seems really confident. It's a good path forward. There's a couple grants we have in the works right now that are being reviewed. The Department of Community Economic Development grant goes in next week. Growing Greener's out with the project today. It's very hopeful. And then we were looking for direct, so I think we have all the, moving in the right direction. We talked to all the right people to move this forward. When this money was announced, we right away, we went to DEP and met with Bammer. So we were all on board and we were the first one to the table as this moves forward.
So that, 244 million is gonna be strictly for restoration projects?
Yeah,
All
both-
A and B
both
restoration
surface-
or any kind of
both
restoration?
surface and stream reclamation. That money should be released next year, later this year. We've always struggled, most of the grants for the state require a 10% match, 20% match. These federal monies that are coming have a 0% match. So this is very hopeful. For a small group like ours that operates on 2,000 a year budget, we can't, it's very hard for us to find these big matching monies.
I think another thing is when you're like, what can I do to help? And there's a couple things. One of them is vote for things that are important. One of them is growing greener. Every so many years, you see this ballot initiative called Growing Greener, and you have a chance to vote for it. That makes a huge difference in watersheds like this right here. So if you have the chance to vote for that, that is one of the absolute best things you can do to help this move forward. Another one is join the watershed group, be active. They have plantings, they have outreach events, things like that. Even if you don't want to routinely be a member, if you get your contact information to them, then if there's a tree planting or something like that where they need volunteers, they can sort of get you out to help with those things.
So over the last year, we meet with the EPA on a monthly basis. Washington DC took a liking to our group that we could, the best way to improve Shamokin and bring back revitalization to Shamokin is to have a clean stream flow through it. So people are more likely not to throw their litter on the ground if there's someone fishing in the stream. So I think they believe, and I think we're starting to believe in ourselves, the best way to revitalize this area is the stream. Anything else? So I have one quote that I really like. It says, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." So we can leave it with that.
Mention that video.
Yeah, I don't know how, I think is there, Jeff is in the room here. He's a drone pilot and he did a whole video from Centralia all the way down to Sunbury, and he narrates it and he gives you all more information than I could ever, the details, the history, how we could fix it. But he touched each tributary along the way and goes in depth how in a half-hour video. So he speeds it up a lot and moves right through, but it's very, very well received by us so far, and I think everyone in the room would really enjoy it.
Yeah.
The
We
link.
have-
Is that on the website?
Sorry, it's not yet. We're gonna make sure it gets highlighted at the top of our website. It's currently on our Facebook page. It's been shared around to a lot of groups. So if you have Facebook, you can find it there. You don't even need an account to go to our Facebook page. You can just go directly to it. It's facebook.com/Shamokin Creek. And you'll find it there, but we're gonna make sure to get it listed on our website as well.
Mention the video that's going to be viewed at one of the.
Yeah, Jeff's video was picked to be viewed at the as the main conference at State College in July, or
It's June, at the Abandoned Mine Land Conference on June 22nd, 23rd.
so that's a feather in Jeff's cap, but it really pulls it together for what our group, the hurdles we face, and how we could, as you explained, a checklist and how we could check off these hurdles one by one.
Well, it even amazed us as the watershed group and visiting these different tributaries. It was amazing to see it from the air.
I don't know, does anyone online have any questions, or are we all?
No, we're all caught up. We've had a few comments which I've been able to respond to, but thank you to everyone who was able to join us online today. We really appreciate you participating.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was very good. Thank you so much.